You may think nothing is changing because you cannot see evidence yet. But some of the most important shifts begin in places you cannot access, conversations you are not in, decisions you have not heard about, opportunities still taking shape, people being moved into position, and circumstances quietly rearranging. The hardest thing about silence is that it convinces us that nothing is happening. If nothing has changed in weeks, months, or even years, silence can become very convincing. We begin looking at our lives as they exist today and quietly making conclusions about tomorrow. Nothing is changing. Nothing is opening. Nothing is moving. Nothing is coming together. Nothing is working out. But the truth is, we don't actually know that. Because some of the most important shifts in our lives begin in places we cannot access. They begin in conversations we are not part of, decisions we have not heard about, opportunities that are still taking shape, people being moved into position that we have not yet met, circumstances quietly rearranging themselves in ways we could never have anticipated. Long before something becomes visible in your life, there may have been dozens of things unfolding behind the scenes that made it possible. That's true of almost everything that has ever changed your life. Which is why I wonder if we've become too quick to make conclusions from silence. Because silence is not evidence that nothing is happening. It is simply evidence that you cannot yet see what is happening. And perhaps that is where faith becomes an invitation to remain open to possibilities we cannot yet see. Because sometimes, while we are waiting for our prayers to be answered, we fail to consider that perhaps they are already being worked out in ways we do not yet recognize. Not every blessing arrives all at once. Sometimes it arrives one conversation at a time, one unexpected opportunity at a time, one door opening at a time, one quiet and seemingly insignificant moment at a time. And by the time it becomes visible in your life, it may have been unfolding behind the scenes far longer than you realized. I think one of the reasons silence feels so uncomfortable is because we assume we should be able to see progress while it's happening. We want evidence that something is changing, evidence that something is opening, evidence that our prayers are moving toward something tangible. But so many of the things that eventually change our lives are completely invisible to us until the moment they aren't. Think about how many things had to quietly come together for some of the most meaningful moments of your life to happen. Opportunities you never saw coming, people you never expected to meet, doors you never imagined would open, chapters of your life that you could not have anticipated while you were living a completely different one. None of those things announced themselves before they arrived, which makes me wonder how many things are already quietly unfolding that you simply don't know about yet. Because life is not always as still as it appears to be. Sometimes it is simply unfolding beyond what we can presently see. There are opportunities quietly taking shape that have not yet become visible to you. There are open doors emerging in ways that you do not recognize yet. There are prayers being worked out in ways that you do not yet recognize. And there are blessings quietly coming together in ways that today's circumstances could never reveal. While you have been looking for evidence that something is changing, things have been quietly unfolding beyond what you can presently see. Not all at once, but one conversation at a time, one open door at a time, one unexpected opportunity at a time, one quiet unfolding at a time. God is still working in the silence, and perhaps that is why silence can be so deceptive. It asks us to believe that if we cannot yet see movement, then there isn't any. But silence has never been qualified to tell the whole story, because today's circumstances cannot reveal everything that is still coming together for your life. There are blessings still taking shape. There are prayers still being worked out. There are open doors that have not yet revealed themselves, and God is still making room for blessings to emerge in your life. Sometimes we don't realize until much later that certain chapters of our lives weren't only ending, they were making space for entirely new ones to begin. We tend to think of endings and beginnings as separate experiences, but perhaps they are much closer together than we realize. While one thing is ending, something else may have already been quietly beginning. And despite how difficult certain endings can be, they do not get to decide what is still possible for your life. They do not get to become the final authority over what God can still unfold from here. Because God has always been able to do more with our stories than we could imagine while we are still living them. Which means that today's disappointments do not automatically become tomorrow's conclusions. What closed is not all that remains. What didn't work out is not all that is still possible. What ended is not all that God can still do from here. Because while you have been looking at what has changed, God has never stopped making room for what is still possible. And perhaps that is another reason we must be so careful about making conclusions from today's circumstances. Because despite their efforts to disrupt your life, your story is not over. Despite the disappointments, there is still so much more becoming possible for you and your life. And despite what closed, God is still making room for what comes next. Because God is still unfolding chapters that have not yet introduced themselves to you. God is still making room for blessings to emerge in your life. And sometimes what feels like a setback becomes the very thing that makes room for opportunities, experiences, and open doors that are more aligned with who you are becoming. Not because what happened wasn't difficult, not because it didn't matter, but because difficult chapters were never meant to inherit the rest of your life story. There are still blessings quietly coming together. There are still prayers being worked out. There are still wonderful chapters waiting to unfold. And there is still more coming together for your life than today's circumstances can presently reveal. That is why we must remain hopeful about what is still possible for our lives. Because we cannot yet see everything that is still unfolding. We cannot yet see every conversation, every opportunity, every open door, or every blessing that is still quietly coming together. Which means that we were never meant to carry the responsibility of knowing exactly how every beautiful thing would unfold. And there is something incredibly freeing about realizing that we were never meant to know how every blessing would unfold. We want timelines, we want answers, we want evidence, we want to know where we're going and how we're going to get there. But perhaps some blessings are meant to remain blessings precisely because we do not get to control how they unfold. Perhaps that is why silence asks something different of us. Not passivity, not inaction, and not waiting for our lives to begin, but openness. The openness to continue saying yes to opportunities. The openness to continue showing up for our lives. The openness to remain curious about what may still be possible. The openness to release our need to know exactly how, when, and through whom every beautiful thing will arrive. Because God is still working in places we cannot presently see. And if that is true, then perhaps we are not being asked to figure everything out before we take the next step. Perhaps we are only being asked to take the next step that belongs to today. To continue applying for the opportunity. To continue learning something new. To continue saying yes when life invites us into what is unfolding. Because alignment has never meant controlling how the blessing arrives. Sometimes it simply means remaining open enough to receive it when it does. There is a difference between releasing hope and releasing control. You are not being asked to release hope. You are simply being invited to release your grip on believing there is only one way for beautiful things to emerge in your life. Because blessings are often much more creative than we give them permission to be. They do not always arrive through the doors we expected. They do not always introduce themselves in the ways we imagined. And they do not always emerge according to the timelines we created for them. Sometimes they quietly unfold into something more amazing than we would have known to ask for ourselves. If this video reminded you to remain open to what may still be possible for your life, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who may need the reminder that some of life's most beautiful blessings quietly unfold long before they become visible. There are still conversations that have not yet happened. There are still opportunities quietly taking shape beyond what you can presently see. There are still prayers being worked out in ways that you do not yet recognize. There are still blessings quietly coming together in ways that today's circumstances could never reveal. There are still beautiful chapters of your story continuing to unfold. And perhaps that is all today's silence has ever been. A reminder that not everything unfolding in your life requires your awareness in order to be real. The blessing is already being worked out behind the scenes.